All right. So one of the first things that many students of children's literature learn is that this discourse is marked by an imbalanced communicative situation. That means that many children's books are authored by adults, while its primary audience consists of children and adolescents. Although this may be true for many books that you will find in the children's and YA sections of bookstores and libraries, it's not the only model. Especially if we look beyond the printed book, we see that children and adolescents produce, for example, fan fiction that is widely read and commented on. Some young authors also print or self-publish their work in the form of zines, for example. And in some cases, young writers manage to publish their work with an established publishing house. In The Child Writer from Austen to Wolfe, Christine Alexander and Juliet McMaster argue that children who write should deserve more attention in children's literature studies. The child's expression of his or her own subjectivity is there and available for us if we only take the time to pay attention. In the vast mass of writings about children, there should be a place for what children have to tell us of themselves. In the past few decades, various scholars, such as Victoria Ford-Smith, Mara Guber, Claudia Mills, Ute Detmar, Helma van Lierop, Nina Christensen, Justina Deszczyobczak, Lise Whistling, and many others have indeed done so, laying bare children's and adolescents' creative contributions to writing, art, and performance. And here are some titles that have come out of this research. Despite their efforts, however, the space reserved for child and adolescent authors is still rather modest if we look at the histories of children's literature, the handbooks, the scholarly research. Mara Guber calls this a form of etonormative amnesia, with etonormative referring to the adult norm that in this case favors adult-authored writing over children's texts. And of course, we thank Maria Nikolaeva for the term etonormative. What this means in this case is that the child is seen as not yet adult and the young author as not yet fully developed as an author. Guber criticizes the consequent forgetfulness that erases children's accomplishments from cultural history. When a member of a particular age group accomplishes something that seems at odds with the stereotypes associated with that group, their achievement is often regarded as exceptional and then is promptly forgotten. This kind of forgetfulness allows our preconceived notions to remain intact. Our beliefs about people in particular age groups persist despite the existence of many, many exceptions. So in this presentation, I will focus on three of those between quotation marks exceptions from the Netherlands and Flanders, the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, where I'm also from. So these findings were part of a research project that I've recently completed called Constructing Age for Young Readers, which explores how age plays a part in children's literature on various levels. The aim of this project was to contribute to more age awareness about the content, production, and reception of children's books. So I'm briefly going to tell you a little bit more about the project and then zoom in on the published adolescent authors. So as part of the project, amongst others, we explored whether the age of the intended reader had an impact on the style and content of children's books. This is a topic explored, amongst others, by Lindsay Jebels. And in addition, for Leander Dutois' PhD, we had the same book read by readers of different ages to find out if their age had an impact on their interpretation and assessment of the book. But the research question that is relevant for my talk today is whether and how the age of the author impacts the writing process and the literary output of that author. For this, the project focused on the oeuvre of authors with a long writing career during which they grew older. And you see two of them here. The one on the top is Bart Moejaert, and the one at the bottom is Joke van Leeuwen, two authors who write in Dutch. Now, three authors in my corpus published their first works in their teenage years. So let me first introduce them to you. So these are my three case studies. At the age of 15, Aline Sachs started writing her debut, Mist over het strand, or Fog on the Beach, a young adult historical novel about the Second World War, and it was published when she was 17. As an adolescent and young adult author, she published several historical novels and then later diversified her oeuvre with picture books and books for younger children. Her graphic novel, The War Within These Walls, is also available in English. Also at the age of 15, Anna Woltz started writing a weekly column for the Dutch newspaper De Volkskrant. She then moved on to write her first humorous children's book, Alles kookt over, or Everything Boils Over. Today, she's one of the most widely translated, read, and awarded authors of the Netherlands. So several of her books have been translated into German, English, and here you see two pictures that I borrowed from her website, and maybe you can recognize some of your own languages on these covers. And if you do want to read a book by Anna Woltz, they're highly recommended. She's really one of my favorite children's author in Dutch literature. The most famous of my three case studies is the Flemish author Bart Moejaert, winner of the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award, and several times he was shortlisted for the Hans Christian Andersen Medal. He made his debut at the age of 19 with Duet met valse noten, or Duet with False Notes, based on a story that he had started inventing in his diary when he was 13. The novel is still in print and widely read today, and Moejaert since then has established a very diverse oeuvre with children's books, YA, picture books, poetries, and plays. Some of his books are available in English, but there are also many titles in German, Italian, in various Scandinavian languages, and of course, since the Alma, also in Swedish. So in my talk, I will present them as three case studies to counter some of the heteronormative prejudices that still exist around such young authors. And so my research is based on interviews with the three of them, as well as with some of their publishers, on archival material, and on an analysis of some of their early works. So what are these prejudices on young authors that we find in literary criticism and scholarship? Although young authors often capture the interest of the press, and indeed their young age is often used in marketing, their writing is sometimes seen as imitative, modeled on popular trends which they are supposedly emulating without, much critical reflection, so in a very derivative way. And for some older authors, this is a reason to dismiss or destroy their own juvenilia. Moreover, child and adolescent authorship is more often associated with spontaneous creativity rather than with strategic professionalism and hard work. In some cases, they are presented as creative geniuses, and an example here would be the diary of Anne Frank. Even though, many specialists in the field of children's literature will know that Anne Frank consciously edited her own journal in the anticipation of a potential future publication. Now, the image that emerged from the interviews that I had with the three authors is quite nuanced. And while spontaneous creativity is not necessarily absent from their work, their descriptions of their writing process mainly struck me because of their professionalism and persistence. So all three authors remember their younger selves as highly passionate authors who took their own writing very seriously and wanted to be published and read. And in order to achieve that goal, they had to get organized. So one challenge that they all mentioned was finding, or rather making, the time to write. So while still in secondary school, Aline Sachs, for example, had to work very hard to finish her novels. She describes this. I had to leave school. And actually, I'm going to read this in Dutch. Sorry. So I have the English translation here, but I do want you to hear some Dutch. So I'm going to read this quote in Dutch. Ik moest om 8:15 vertrekken naar school. Dus ik stond een beetje vroeger op, zodat ik van 7:30 tot 7:15 nog kon schrijven. Indeed, writing a full novel requires a lot of time and organization, and Sachs was able to do so because of this very disciplined writing scheme, a first sign of professionalism. And of course, summer holidays were also spent writing. 15-year-old Anna Woltz, by contrast, decided on a different strategy to deal with the limited time left after school and homework were done. And you see her here. So Anna Woltz decided to turn the time spent at school into an advantage. Now, as I've already mentioned, young authors' intimate knowledge of youth gives them credibility and attracts public attention. Now, at the age of 15, Anna Woltz was keenly aware of this when she contacted the Dutch newspaper, De Volkskrant, to offer her services as a columnist. This initiative was not only informed by her desire to get published, but also by a lack of opportunities that she observed for her peers to share their knowledge and perspective on life. In 1997, teenagers barely had a voice of their own. Social media didn't exist yet, and in newspapers, teenagers were rarely interviewed. They were only ever written about. So I thought, it's interesting if a teenager gets the floor and writes from within about what goes on at school. So what she did, she sent 2 writing samples to the newspaper, and her proposal was accepted. So during 1 year, Anna Woltz reported weekly under a pseudonym on adolescent life, with the aim of taking an anthropological perspective on youth. The addressee that she had in mind, and so this is her pseudonym, Rebecca Maert, and the addressee that she had in mind was adults somewhere far, far away at the other end of the world. The tone that Anna Woltz adopted in her columns was that of a participant observer who is part of a group and reports on it to an outsider. So those were the adults far, far away. Now, according to the anthropologist Alpa Shah, such a position displays a dialectical relationship between intimacy and estrangement. It's a form of befriending strangers. But of course, Anna Woltz was a particular kind of participant observer because she was already befriended with the people that she was observing, and she was not addressing other researchers, but readers of a newspaper. Through reporting on her peers, she did take a distance from them, and her columns are marked by a funny, ironic tone. However, as she was taking her first steps as a professional writer, the dialectic of intimacy and a stranger also put her at risk, as I will show in a moment. But let's first look at her columns. So Woltz reports on the habits of 15-year-olds as if they are a foreign species, while at the same time she's part of that group herself. This double perspective allows her to shed light on the habits and the psychology of this age group, for example, when she describes peer pressure and clothing. So this is a longer quote from one of her colleagues of columns. The arrival of the school photographer made it clear at one glance, what everybody's favorite outfit was. Hair had been washed, as had clothes, and that cute little necklace was finally being worn again. Of course, everyone pretended that they had forgotten completely about the photographer, but hairbrushes abounded. And then she goes on to reflect a bit more on clothing and trends in clothing among her classmates. Everyone's nightmare is that someone has bought the same item as you. That's why you have to wear new clothes as quickly as possible to show that this little skirt or that jumper has been claimed by you. That way, everyone knows that you are first, that you are not a copycat. For this reason, you can already see children sweltering in warm winter coats right now. And she's writing this, in early September. After all, you have to prevent anyone else from buying it. So the tone of this young anthropologist is witty, and her irony cuts across age categories. So she also often writes about parents and teachers. A recurrent topic in the columns is to dispel ideas that adults hold about teenagers. So Waltz presents herself as an expert on teen culture and psychology, and she does this in a very interesting column, I think, where she is discussing the intensity of being an adolescent without the benefit of being able to look back. So here she, in fact, claims superiority as a teenage author over an adult author. So she writes in the column, an adult can write a moving little story about his memories of Jim in school, how he would always be the last one left when teams had to be chosen. There's often a sort of vengeance involved, a see how well I've ended up. But when we have Jim, teams are chosen too. But since no one knows how he will end up, it's very humiliating to be the last one left. So an adult writer who describes an adolescent experience in hindsight does this with reassurance, Waltz suggests. The teenager who is rejected is left with just that feeling. So I see here a similarity between some of the interviews that I've read with the very young Bart Moejaert. Like Moejaert, in those interviews, Waltz positioned herself as an expert of youth by repeatedly highlighting the difference with adults and stressing that living in the moment is not the same as looking back onto it. This falls under what Mara Gubar has called a difference model to interpret the relationship between adulthood and childhood. So Gubar describes how some adult scholars in children's literature sees children almost as a different species, as if the temporal distance makes children categorically unknowable to adults. So what struck me in these first interviews with Moejaert and Anna Waltz's columns is that this difference model is not just adopted by adults who study children, but also by the adolescent authors themselves. They highlight that they are different from adults to reinforce their status as experts and their ability to set the record straight. So they repeatedly stress that adults don't really know them, even though they may think they do. However, the way that Anna Waltz describes her age phase does play into various stereotypes about adolescence that her audience might have expected. So, for example, she writes about intense peer pressure, infatuations with pop stars and film stars, silly humor, and various conflicts with parents and teachers. So in this sense, one may wonder to what extent she really fulfills the promise that her role as a participant observer holds, that is what Al-Pasha calls the potential to question dominant theoretical and political positions. Although Waltz shared various intimate details of adolescent life, it was within a framework that adult readers might have expected from common age norms and that they actually found very funny. Now, the alliance with adult readers, while maintaining the intimacy with her peers, also produced other issues in the course of the year that Anna Waltz wrote her column. Because after all, the role of the participant observer may hold risks, especially with what is called covert observation. So a kind of observation where the community that is being observed is not aware of someone recording or reporting their behavior to a third party. And it's interesting, in one of her first columns, Waltz reflects on the mechanism of high school gossip. And this is a very witty column. So there she says, gossiping is trading. according to certain procedures, confidential information is exchanged. Sometimes there's someone who breaks the rules who is then rejected. Just like the high school gossip, as it's defined here by Waltz, her column could also be seen as a kind of trade-off that relied on an exchange of secret information. The perks for the young columnist were the chance to practice her writing, to be published, and to hold public attention, as well as the satisfaction of the type of gossip that she said in her column that she enjoyed most, speculating about the psychology of her peers. But gossiping also holds the risk of rejection if you break the rules, as she expresses here. And one can hardly imagine a more spectacular way of breaking the rule of trust than writing about your intimate friends' behavior and conversations in a national newspaper. It turned out that Waltz was in reality not just writing for that adult far, far away, but that some of her readers were quite close. And so halfway in the school year that she wrote her columns, Waltz's identity was discovered and revealed. The mother of a classmate who read the Volkskrant had noticed similarities between the events described there and what her daughter told about school. The mother and daughter then followed the column for a few weeks and soon guessed who was writing them. The friend then went to the library, collected and copied all of Waltz's columns and distributed them at school. And for the young author, this was the ultimate nightmare. Everybody was talking about it. I was 15. Of course, it was quite terrifying, and I wasn't sure if I could stay in that school. It's very strange when the entire school is angry with you, including the teachers. But, of course, as a professional columnist, she had an obligation. She had a contract with the newspaper, and she had to go on. So for a few columns, Waltz only focused on herself and a few friends who were not upset. And then after a while, her classmates accepted her writing, and she continued more or less as before. Though I think the big difference that you can notice is that in the first column, individuals can really be identified, and in the last columns that is less so. So she reflects more on habits rather than commenting on clearly identifiable peers. The experience did teach Anna Waltz a few crucial aspects of writing that she took on as an adult writer. The routine that she had established enabled her to write her first longer novel, the children's book Alles kookt over. And this really launched her career as a children's author. So for this book, she still found inspiration in her family, but she no longer tied it so closely to her own life. And in some sense, you can say that her first endeavors as a writer testified to a sort of, almost childlike naivete that, she thinks she could just do this without being discovered. But at the same time, she did at least two things that professional writers also need. She spotted a gap in the market that she could fill, and she established a regular writing routine. Now, what also definitely helped was that she got help from her parents. And indeed, if you want to have your works published in childhood or adolescence, it's helpful to have supportive parents who also take your writing seriously. So Anna Waltz was inspired to see herself as a future author thanks to her parents, who were both journalists. Bart Moyaert says that his last name may have helped in getting published because his father was a school inspector in education and a well-known name with children's publishers, so that helped the manuscript getting noticed. And after Aline Sachs had been using audio cassettes and notebooks to record her writing, her father provided her with an old laptop that helped to speed up her writing. But more importantly, she claims that her fascination with history is something that she owes to her parents, who took 14-year-old Aline to Normandy. And this is where her fascination with the Second World War started. I think that the example of Aline Sachs also shows that not all adolescent writers find inspiration in their own life, as is sometimes claimed. Aline Sachs found a way to combine distance from her own life with intimacy. So until she was 20, the protagonists of her books also always had the same age that she had herself. And even though the two main characters in her debut, so Mist over het strand, are boys, she drew inspiration from her own close relationship with her best friend to whom she dedicated the book. But in her books, she also wanted to transcend what she considered the dull aspects of her own life. So her characters have more spectacular adventures than she ever had, and that was actually what attracted Sachs in the writing process. So in pre-internet times or early internet times, the decision to set those stories in the past, in a past that she had never lived, did involve very extensive research. And perhaps it should come as no surprise that she later got a PhD in history. But here too, as an adolescent, supportive parents came in really handy. So when she was still a teenager, her parents encouraged and fed her interest, and her father helped to fact-check her historical novels, and he was apparently able to spot various mistakes. Now, such an influence of parents is sometimes considered a threat to young authors' authentic voice. A famous case here is the edits that Otto Frank applied to his daughter Anna Frank's diary before it was published. So he eliminated some passages where she spoke openly about her period or where she expressed resentment against her mother. Now, we see the opposite happening in this book, for example. So the work of some young authors has been published deliberately without adult intervention. So this is a book from 1919, Daisy Ashford, The Young Visitors, which has a spelling mistake in the title. Visitors should be spelled with O. And that is the case throughout the book. So the book contains various associative sentences and spelling mistakes that were left in to evoke a sense of authenticity and cuteness. Now, critics of this practice, such as Lise Wesseling, argue that this is in some ways unfair because adult authors who also have their work, published also have their work edited when they submit it to publishers. So why shouldn't children receive the same kind of support? For Aline Sachs and Anna Woltz, the input of their parents in the writing process was rather a matter of intergenerational dialogue, which they solicited themselves, and that can be seen as a real collaboration. So in addition to receiving help from her father, Aline Sachs also enrolled in creative writing courses to improve her writing. So it's not because young authors get stylistic and writing advice that it's no longer their own work. Now, what's interesting is that the former young authors acknowledged the input of their parents in hindsight, but that this was very much downplayed when they first published their works and were interviewed about it. So let's also return here to the young columnist Anna Woltz. So I've already explained that she often uses a difference model to position herself as an expert. And another model that Mara Gubar introduces to explain the relationship between childhood and adulthood is the deficit model. And this is one that sees children as lacking in the knowledge and skills that adults have. Now, it's interesting that Anna Woltz, the teenage Anna Woltz, often slips in such a deficit model, but she reverses it. So she situates the lack of knowledge and skills not in the young, but with the adults who pretend to know teenagers. And here's a quote again from one of her columns. So she says, she writes, adult people who write for teenagers think it's fun to use expressions from 20 years ago. If it's just crazy, it must be good. It's not. Teenage speech is very precise work and almost impossible to imitate. No person says ultra hip. Nobody is ever as rebellious as Nits, and the only one who knows that the Dutch bankaardappel is a translation of the English couch potato is, of course, my mother. Now, what's interesting to consider in this light is the context in which Anna Woltz worked. Not only was she inspired by the literary environment of her home and her parents' profession, she was also coached by her mother, who gave her advice on how to write a good column. So every weekend, they had a walk together to discuss Anna's ideas, and then on Sunday, Anna would write the text and send it off. So it's very striking that while Woltz's writing very much relied on the intergenerational collaboration with her mother, it's never acknowledged in the actual columns, which remains very much stuck in a difference model. So, on the contrary, in one of her columns, she teaches her parents a few lessons. And I think it's particularly interesting that at this point, it was in fact only her parents who knew that she was writing this column. Her secret had not been revealed at this point. So here she writes, parents are so often curious, but they don't dare to ask anything outright. They think they have to be sly to get information about parties, preferences for boys, no approach works there, and feelings that they suspect their child is wrestling with. Then they are terrible and drive you crazy, especially when after such a conversation they say in a friendly tone, you seem to be in a bad mood today. Perhaps you didn't get enough sleep. So Woltz always said that she was fully committed to writing the truth in her columns and that she didn't invent a single scene or example. But in this light, I think it's really interesting that she remains completely silent on the intergenerational ties that fostered her writing. And so I think it's really ironic that she here mocks her parents' curiosity when she discussed the column every week with her mother during the walk. So I always wonder if they discussed this specific example and how her mother may have reacted. So to continue this thought about adult intervention in writing by published teenagers, it's also important to consider the role of the editor. And this can again be a bit contentious in the case of a teenage author, because it can also be seen as an intervention that may jeopardize their voice, and that's not always appreciated by the adolescent authors themselves. And here I think Bart Mouillard's debut is particularly interesting to consider in a bit more detail. So Duet with False Notes is a young adult novel about two teenagers falling in love in secondary school. Lander and Lieselot. The story alternates between these two narrators who describe how they fall in love, have a short relationship, and then break up. And so the story started in a diary at the age of 13 in 1977. And then Bart Mouillard had the manuscript accepted when he was 17, and then it was published when he was 19. And in his next book, he uses a similar setting, also a secondary school. And both novels have been praised for radiating an aura of authenticity because of their very detailed exploration of teenage life, from the very deep feelings of first love to popular culture by teenagers, and also the everyday pranks of a high school classroom. So the book was published with the Catholic publishing house Altiora Averbode, which was still led by clergymen in the early 1980s. And in that context, even a first kiss had to be debated. But there was, in fact, much more than a first kiss to be found in the first typescript that 17-year-old Bart Mouillard submitted to the publisher. It starts, for example, with a very daring opener where Lander describes a visit to the toilet. And I'm going to use this as an opportunity to drink a bit of water because I'm not going to read the quote aloud. You can just read it for yourself. It's a little bit disgusting, I have to warn you. So Lander is describing his number 2. And if you read the book, you will not find this scene because it was removed before publication. This was partly the job of an editor that Bart Moejaert worked with, who was a man in his 40s with a lot of editing and teaching experience. And this older editor, in fact, found his own edits substantial enough to claim in hindsight that he, and not Bart Moejaert, was the true author of Duet met valse noten. And in doing so, he tapped into what Elizabeth Wesseling calls a recurrent hermeneutics of suspicion that questions whether young authors can actually be credited for the merits of their work. And when it comes to books by young authors that have come particularly popular, Juliet McMaster attributes such questions of authenticity to sheer envy. Adult culture, she writes, is jealous of success and resists competition from children. So in the case of Duet met valse noten, which has become a bestseller and which is still in print today, nobody ever really took that editor's claim to authorship very seriously. But what's interesting to consider in this light is the young author's own attitude to the publication history of his debut. So in hindsight, he acknowledges that he learned a lot from the editorial process, even though he regretted some deletions. And for example, when Lieselotte and Lander kiss in an elevator, this had to be adapted to a chaste hug. And Bart Moejaert says, originally, I'd had the idea to let them sleep together. It was then said that that was very cliché, and so I didn't say anything about it. Readers would be able to imagine a version of their own. In my version, Lieselotte lies with her hand, quote, near his member. That was later cut because it was not deemed relevant to use those words in a children's book. Now, young authors, especially adolescents, can use their fiction to play out their sexual fantasies. And fan fiction has made that very clear, as research by Jennifer Duggan has shown, amongst others. But for the editor, Duet met valse noten initially went too far in detailing the sexual dimension of Lieselotte and Lander's relationship, even after the sex scene had been edited out. So the young Bart Moejaert didn't know initially that the word member, so a euphemism for penis, had been replaced with skin in the first published edition of the book. And it was only when he read the book that he found out that this was changed. But when he complained about this in a public radio interview, something interesting happened because the CEO of the publishing house, he was a clergyman, he heard this interview and he grew very concerned about the reputation of his publishing house, which wanted to appeal to contemporary youth. So in the end, skin was replaced with member again. And then it became Willie in a later edition. So they put it back in eventually. And this was very much due to the young author's attention, well, the way he complained about it when he got public media attention. So what's interesting is that the adult intervention in young authors' works is definitely not always black and white. So I've already mentioned Lise Wesseling's view that young authors, like adult ones, can benefit from the expertise of an adult who knows the market. And I think the fact that Bart Moejaert's debut appeared with this Catholic publishing house that had recently started taking a more secular and more daring course is likely to have been a factor in the book's success. because the combination of a youthful perspective of the young author with the more conservative take of an editor who polished off the most offensive aspects of the book may have contributed to its acceptability, amongst others, in the Catholic school network that was still very prominent in Flemish schools at that point. Moreover, it's interesting that in an interview in 1984, the young Bart Moejaert was contemplating a second book and expresses his longing for more freedom than he experienced with his debut. And at the same time, he says that he wants to cut much more now that I'm working on a second book. So apparently he did learn something from this editorial process. And if you read the Alma report, for example, his suggestive style is actually often praised as you know, very much the hallmark of his writing. What's also interesting is that in this interview, he was 19 years old and already distancing himself from a younger audience. So he no longer considers himself fully expert. So he says, then I wonder, is this really suited for 14 to 15-year-olds? Something that he didn't ask when he was writing his book as a 13, 14, and 17-year-old. So, so it is interesting to see that he's now known for this style that suggests more than it spells out. So, although his first experience of being edited was a negative one for him, he did learn a lot from it. Okay, and then I come to my conclusion. The three case studies that I've studied, sorry, that was a bit too fast. The three case studies that I've studied, Aline Sachs, Anna Woltz, and Bart Moejaert, help to nuance some prejudices about the work of young authors. In particular, the idea that their writing is derivative and mostly spontaneous. Instead, their debuts were the result of disciplined work and intergenerational collaboration. Backed up by their parents and/or editors, all three felt comfortable enough to assert themselves as experts on youth, and in the case of Aline Sachs, also on history. All three have obviously evolved as writers, but they do not look down on their younger selves. What's striking is that especially Woltz and Moejaert have evolved from stressing the difference between children or adolescents and adults to what Mara Gubar calls a kinship model, one that stresses the common ground between childhood and adulthood. Gubar writes, there's no one moment when we suddenly flip over from being a child to being an adult. Our younger and older selves are multiple and interlinked, akin to one another rather than wholly distinct. And likewise, Bart Moejaert stresses that the shift from childhood to adulthood is not absolute. When you finally turn 18 and you don't get a party but an electric razor, you know that you're officially ready to have a beard and will be considered part of the adults from now on. But he invites all adults to rebel against that image. Shave off your beard, grab your bike, discover the world. But this is a very different position from what he took when he was actually 17 and stressed his own status as an expert. Anna Woltz thinks that she still benefits from the experience of writing and being published in youth. This she feels really anchored her memories more deeply so that she still remembers what it feels like to be young. And she says that she has no problems at all imagining how children may feel in a given situation. Now that she is an adult author herself, her discourse on adults' understanding of young people has also changed. She does claim that she's able to know and what young people may feel. But other things haven't changed over the years in the way that Anna Woltz experiences intergenerational relationship. So she still knows that it's useless to imitate young people's language and try to sound like them. And her mother is still her first reader. Thank you very much. And I want to close by pointing out that we have a website if you want to read more about this research, and also some of the interviews with the authors that I've referred to. You can find them on the CAFIR website. So you see the address here. And some of the ideas that I developed are also part of the book Age in David Almond's oeuvre, which has also resulted from that same project. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Vanessa, very much for this wonderful insight into how to research, how we can research young people's creativity. Lots of angles that you presented, and lots of orientations, and I think that's very inspirational. And now we have time for questions, comments. You can put some in the chat, of course, but we also invite you to now unmute your mics. And of course, also, if you want to switch the cameras on. So we have some time for questions, please. Okay, I can see no questions at the moment, but if I may, maybe it's more of a comment than a question. What I found fascinating, and you kept stressing that over and over again, rightly so, I think, is this continuum of relationships and power relationships in particular that occur in this whole process of creating a book, talking about it as well by a young person, talking about it, discussing, presenting it, and how it's never. We might think that maybe young people publishing we are talking about some kind of empowerment of young people when they publish their own books, but on the other hand, and then we disempower adults in that case, but that's not it doesn't happen really. It's rather a continuum of various intensities in the whole process, and you showed wonderfully how it happens.
And if I can add to that a short thing, something that I left out for reasons of time is that it's interesting to see adulthood as a continuum there, because Bart Mouillard actually had two editors. So one was a man in his 40s with a lot of experience, but the other editor was somebody that the publishing house had recently hired, and she was a graduate. So she was in her early 20s. And she really saw the merit in his work. She loved how it was completely different, from everything else that was being published. And so I think she also made a crucial contribution in stressing how important it was to have this author published, because she saw the appeal.
Okay, thank you. And we have two questions from the audience now, Nina and then Kim. So Nina, please first. Nina, you need to unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Okay, thank you for reminding me, Justina. Thank you very much, Vanessa, for a wonderful presentation. So much material to discuss, but basically I have one question that I also ask myself, and this concerns how or to which degree to work with the text produced by young adults would lead us in the direction of changing our idea of quality in a text for children and young adults. I know it's a big question.
Actually, I would say not for these case studies. I think all three debuts are actually really good books. as well, or columns. And I think you, like with Anna Woltz, you can clearly, and she also testified to this, that she really got advice on what a good column looks like, that she got advice that, you know, you open it in a certain way, then you give concrete, witty examples, and then at the end you make the circle round. So she applies that like really in an excellent way. And with Bart Moejaert, it's true that his early work received some criticism as well. But at the same time, it's also so original in its modesty, I would say, in also really and again, he testified to that in interviews as well. Like one interviewer said, not much spectacular happens in the book until the very end, but I'm not going to reveal that. But then Bart Moejaert responded, but actually, for a teenager, the things that happen are quite spectacular. And perhaps that is a way that you have to broaden up your view of what is you know, aesthetic or what's interesting to read about. But at the same time, it's also very moving because of the modesty with which he writes. So maybe the answer is yes and no.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question and for the answer. Kim, please.
Hi, Vanessa. That was great. It was really lovely to hear what you've been working on. And I think my question may be a simple one for you to answer, but I couldn't answer it myself. You, towards the end, you talked about, I think it was Bart Moejaert saying, you know, get on your bike and go out as an adult and find your inner child in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And you spent a lot of time thinking about the hidden adult in children's literature. But I wondered if you found a hidden adult in these writers. Is there already one there that's shaping the work? So instead of, you know, accessing your inner child, are you accessing your inner adult in a way? Oh, in 1 second, my doorbell's just, okay, Peter's getting it, good.
Yeah, say hi to Peter. Yeah, I think well, it's always difficult to answer such a question without falling into some of the, you know, stereotypes that we also associate with adulthood, which you know, I'm also invested in dispelling. So I think, for example, you could say the professionalism is already something that we might associate more with adulthood, but which is in fact is something that these authors also adopted. I think they definitely had role models that they wanted to follow. So in that sense, you might say, you know, that they were already aspiring to certain adult roles. But yeah, I think the what I'm also trying to say with this talk is that it is a continuum, and that professionalism is not just reserved for adults, but you know, if young people are dedicated and want to reach something, and of course we don't just see this in writing, we also see it in sports, you know, in young professionals in the theater, that indeed,
that was my point in a way, that the hidden adult is, you know, is there from the beginning and inform, you know, it's there to the end as well, and the child then stays in. So there is that continuum. Anyway,
yeah.
Thank you. Great case studies.
Thanks.
Thank you again for the question, for the answer. We have some comments in the chat. I don't know, Vanessa, if you can access the chat.
Yeah, I wasn't looking, but I'll do that now.
We have some examples
yes.
shared.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
see the Christopher Pauline.
Yeah.
Sarah Zonneveld. I didn't know that one, so I'm grateful for that suggestion, Maud. Yeah. Justina, is there a question that I'm missing? I mostly see comments which are super.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I'll be writing down the suggestions.
Do we have any other questions, comments?
Ma'am, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, please. Yes. I was thinking that there was one more question. Yes, please go on. Yes.
This question. So when the child or the young person is a very cultural specific thing, so how can we choose the author when if the author is child or young per se? How do we do it in different culture or time frame? How can we do that?
Yeah, thank you, Kirti, for the question. Indeed, I think childhood and adolescence are, culturally specific concepts. Perhaps just based on my research, there are two things that I want to add to that. First, it was implicit in my talk, but I don't mind making it more explicit that the three people that I talked about were privileged. So they were privileged in the support that they received from their parents. They were privileged in the focus that they were able to find. They were very well cared for. And yeah, so they were able to do this in an environment that was highly supportive of their writing. And second of all, they're all adolescents. And with all the people I interviewed, it struck me that the age of 15 was often mentioned as a crucial point where several people told me this, that they had been writing and they had some attempts, but it really only got started at the age of 15. It really struck me that age appeared a few times as a moment when they seem to be capable to get organized enough and to make enough time to write something longer and actually finish it and submit it. And I see that Christopher Pauline is also mentioned here. I think that is another author who totally fits that model, also with the kind of support that he experienced from his family. And then indeed, again, the age of 15, or well, probably he started writing it a bit sooner, but again, as a moment when things really clicked in a way that he was also able to write a full novel.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the question and for the answer. We still have time maybe for one more question. Okay, maybe if I may, again, question, comment, rather question this time. Do you see any difficulties in this kind of research? What is challenging? What can be challenging from the perspective of the researcher trying to look at such cases? You had access to these people, right? To these young, well, then young now adults authors. So that's a big asset. Definitely.
Thank you for asking that methodological question, because I think there are challenges. First of all, a lot of what I've been talking about is not documented. So in the case of Anna Woltz, of course, I had the columns, and then I had to rely on her memories. I didn't get to interview the parents, which would have been interesting, but that didn't work out. So it also depends on what she remembers. So in the case of Anna Woltz, she seems to remember things very clearly, but at the same time, there's also no way of checking it. In the case of Bart Moejaert, it got really interesting because various people remembered different things. So in his case, I was, for Bart Moejaert, I interviewed him. I interviewed the two publishers. The publisher who made the cuts had passed away, and we also decided, because of some of the criticism, that we wouldn't mention him by name. I think people who know the Flemish context would be able to identify him, but we decided that we wouldn't mention him by name. But I was able to interview the young editor as well as another person working in the publishing house, and they actually remembered things differently. And very often also said, I just don't remember. So I had a lot of archival material from Bart Moejaert, but then in patching together who did what, that was really difficult. And so, yeah, the stories were contradictory, and yeah. And the same thing goes for Eileen Sachs. So I interviewed her. I had the novel. I didn't have any archival material for her book. But again, it's what people tell. And oh yeah, and of course, what I also had for all authors were like early interviews. So I was able to trace those. But from those patchy things, you have to try and reconstruct what happened. And there are definitely, yeah, some parts of the story where you can ask, did people remember this correctly? Have they also turned it into their own narrative? It's definitely true that some of the older material contradicted what they remembered. Yeah.
But I'm also, thank you. I'm also thinking that maybe, yeah, indeed, staying with this problem, so to say, of not being able to have the full story is in fact fascinating, right? And there's this, it's an intriguing aspect of this research that we cannot determine fully, right, what happened. And I think it will always be some kind of construct, right, as of course our past is as we remember it. So that's on the other hand, it's a challenge, but on the other hand, I think it's actually quite fascinating, right, to be thinking that, you don't need to, probably there's nothing to prove here, right, but you have these all sorts of accounts, right, that you can access, detailed, maybe less detailed in some cases, maybe with some interests there as well. Who knows, right? Okay. I think if there are no more comments, no more questions, then Vanessa, once again, thank you very much. And please join me in applauding her for her beautiful talk and insight into her work. Thank you very much for sharing. And of course, to everyone who,
thank you all for coming,
who have joined us this evening in Wrocław, but I do realize it might be different time zones as well across the audience. So thank you very much for finding the time to join us. And of course,